did the Earth look like at the time of the first animals? What shape did the very first living organism take? When did it appear? Why did it appear? Where? So many questions arise as our minds wander over this terrain. We'd like to know everything, discover everything, understand everything. Our reason dictates that there is a beginning and an end to everything. How did the first living things begin? How did they live? What did they eat? What was the Earth like then? Hundreds of millions of years ago, there were no borders, no flags to separate the Earth's soil from that of its neighbors. The geography and climate were very different from what you know today, and the flora and fauna were still very primitive. The world's biodiversity is so luxuriant, so astonishing, so rich that it's impossible to know all the animal and plant species that inhabit our Earth. The fauna and flora are so vast that nearly 10 million terrestrial species are still unknown to us. Have you ever wondered what our planet was like before life? What kind of landscapes did we encounter? How did the Earth become the cradle of life? Do you have any idea how evolution worked in the world of living things? Lots of questions that need lots of answers, don't they? How would you like to land on Earth sometime after its birth? We could go back in time in a fraction of a second and witness all the key stages of our history. As privileged spectators, Precambrian fossils are essential to understanding the emergence of complex life on our planet. So it's precisely to this era that we must go. Dear traveler, welcome. Today we're off to explore the history of our planet and discover the first surprising creatures that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. But before you set off on your next adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing. Thank you, and have a great trip! Going back in time, back to the past, yesterday, a century ago, 4 billion years ago. All these periods are part of the past, some of them so far away. Time passes slowly for some, and with dizzying speed for others. Time is measurable. We speak of hours, minutes, seconds, and even hundredths of a second in sporting competitions. We count the years that pass, the time that elapses. We study centuries and epochs. And yet, even if mankind is capable of measuring time, he is limited to his conception of the future. There comes a time when numbers beyond 6 zeros have trouble echoing in our minds. Elapsed time is too distant and too vast. It is so distant from us that it is beyond human comprehension and understanding. When the historical period is counted in millions of years, it's hard to get our minds around such an amplitude of time. These figures are far too large for our brains to assimilate. This is why we no longer speak in years but in geological periods. These different geological and temporal phases are more meaningful to the human mind. Since the invention of writing, just over 3,000 years ago, researchers, experts, and historians have relied on written, tangible, verifiable, and comparable evidence. Art, Tools, clothing, kitchen utensils, and weapons are all objects that can tell the story of their owner at a given time and place. They have enabled us to go back in time and discover the way of life of early man, for example. But long before you were born, long before the birth of man, our Earth was already alive. Animals and plants populated the continents and oceans hundreds of millions of years before we did. When we go back that far in time, only the Earth can tell us about these past adventures. No book, no manuscript, no object, no painting can tell the story of the past to mankind's quest for knowledge. It's in the Earth that the vestiges of the past are buried. Each new discovery by archaeologists and paleontologists reveals a new facet of the great mystery of life and the history of our world. This is why the different phases of life on our planet are closely linked to the Earth's geology. They have made it possible to design a timescale over long periods. They make it possible to retrace the past from the birth of the Earth to the present day over almost 4.5 billion years. Geologists have constructed this stratigraphic timescale in which each phase is marked by a precise event. An international commission is updating this geological scale as scientific advances and discoveries are made. For greater clarity, it has been divided into periods, eras, and eons. This hierarchical structure makes it easier to assimilate events and provides a better overview of the most important events in our history. When we talk about original flora and fauna, we're mainly talking about the Phanerozoic eon, which stretches from 542 million years ago to the present day. You're probably familiar with the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous eras. You may even have heard a lot about the Cambrian. To help you keep track of time, here are the main elements you need to know. They form the stratigraphic scale. The long Phanerozoic period you know is the last eon of the scale. It includes the Paleozoic era, the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and Permian periods. This is followed by the Mesozoic era and the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods. Finally, from the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs some 65.5 million years ago to the present day, we speak of the Cenozoic era, which successively comprises the Paleogene, Neogene, and Quaternary periods. These different periods are rich in history. The geology, flora, and fauna are amazing and fascinating to study. But even if these periods are very distant by human standards, they are, after all, very recent in terms of the Earth and terrestrial life itself. But today, we're going to go much further back in our history, long before the first placental mammals and the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs of the Cretaceous, long before the division of Pangaea, the first flowering plants, and the first birds of the Jurassic, long before the first dinosaurs and oviparous mammals of the Triassic. A real leap back in time, and beyond anything you seem to know, beyond anything you can imagine. We'll go back to the Permian and its unprecedented extinction, the Carboniferous, and its population of giant insects, its first big trees, and the appearance of reptiles, the Devonian and its amphibians, the Silurian and its first land plants, the Ordovician and its invertebrates, and even the Cambrian, which left such a mark with its major changes and its first algae. Let's go back to the genesis of life to witness its birth, but also its evolution. For over 540 million years, we have lived in one of the richest eons the blue planet has ever known, the Phanerozoic. But our planet is much older than that. These 540 million years are, after all, only a tiny part of its life, representing just 1/8 of its history. How about starting the story where it all really began? The Cambrian represents such a major change for our world that in order to refer to the entire preceding period, we have chosen to call this eon the Precambrian. What you may not know is that the Precambrian is such a long and rich period that it constitutes a super eon in itself. The Precambrian super eon is subdivided into 3 eons: the Hadean, the Archean, and the Proterozoic. While the Proterozoic is the eon of particular interest to us in terms of evolution, let's take a quick look at the 2 preceding eons. They will undoubtedly give you a better understanding of the changes that take place during the Proterozoic. We'll be there 4.5 billion years before today. This period of our history goes so far back in time that it's almost impossible to have a realistic representation based on factual evidence. Only a few minerals, zircons dating from this period, are known today. Thanks to our current technologies and the few elements we have in our procession, experts have been able to put forward hypotheses on the Hadean period based on a theoretical approach, but also on elements of comparison inspired by other planets. The Hadean is a time interval that begins with the accretion of our planet, i.e., the capture of matter by a star under the effect of gravitation. In other words, it corresponds to the birth of our planet, Earth. The Hadean began 4.568 billion years ago. Compared to the extent of the stratigraphic scale, this is a short period. The Hadean ends around 4 billion years ago, which corresponds to the age of the oldest known rocks. But it was the very first eon on the Earth's geological timescale, and many events took place over a short period of time. As you can imagine, conditions were extreme and hostile to all forms of life. This is why, in 1972, American geologist Preston Cloud first named this chronological and geological period the Hadean, in reference to the Greek god of the underworld, Hades. The most characteristic events of the Hadean are the separation of metal and silicate. The denser metal migrated towards the planet's interior to form the core, while the less dense silicates remained in the outer part to form the mantle. This is a major event for our planet. According to scientists, it is undoubtedly the formation of the core that makes the Earth's magnetic field possible. Even today, it is this field that protects us from the solar wind. Without this key stage, no life could have developed. Even if life is not yet present, this phenomenon remains closely linked to its future emergence. The Earth's gravitational accretion energy, radioactive energy, and core-forming energy have become important sources of heat. These sources unleash such energy and heat that they promote the fusion of the entire outer part of the young planet. This fusion gives rise to a magma ocean. During the first few million years, the Earth also undergoes a cooling phase, allowing the crust to gradually form. Our planet had an atmosphere, but as you can imagine from the landscape before your eyes, it was radically different from the one we have today. The atmosphere consisted mainly of nitrogen and CO2, with small amounts of methane and ammonia. It could be defined as a primitive atmosphere. All this suggests that the Earth was then an azoic planet, i.e. an environment with no traces of animal or plant life. It's very difficult to know more about this period, since rocks dating back to the Hadean are almost non-existent. However, a few deposits dating back 3.9 billion years could point to prebiotic activity, and we don't know whether this might have begun a few million years earlier during the Hadean. It's on this unsolved scientific enigma, which leaves an extraordinary field of possibilities, that I suggest we continue our journey, leaving behind the Hadean and embarking on a new era, the Archean. The Archean era began around 4 billion years ago. Not chosen at random by the International Stratigraphic Commission, this is the age of the oldest rocks we know. No known rock predates 4 billion years. A fundamental change took place between the Archean, the second era of the Precambrian, and the Proterozoic, the last era of this super eon. The result is a new way of functioning for our planet. To understand these new elements of the Proterozoic, you need to go back to the source of this phenomenon. You'll then be able to better understand and perceive the various consequences. Here we are, at the dawn of the Archean, just 4 billion years ago. This long period lasted nearly 1.5 billion years. The Archean was marked by intense magmatic activity, leading to the extraction of almost 3/4 of the volume of the continental crust from the mantle. We talked about the Earth's crust during the Hadean, and you'll remember that while it was solid, it was still rather thin. During this new era, it develops and thickens. While our continental crust is mainly granitic and covered with sedimentary rock, this was not at all the case 2 to 4 billion years ago. Sedimentary rock existed very little, if at all. At that time, magmatic rock was predominant. Another key feature of the Archean era was plate tectonics. Plate movements are still with us today. Traces of these movements can be found at specific points around the globe. In a continental collision, the overriding plate may advance several hundred kilometers onto the plate being overridden. It will then push shreds of the overlapped crust and form what are known as thrust sheets. Surprisingly, this type of movement was already present nearly 4 billion years ago. The same traces of thrust sheets can be found in rocks dating from the Archean period. The only significant difference between yesterday's movements and those of today is that billions of years ago, the plates were much smaller, only 100 kilometers or about 50 miles. At this stage in the life of our young planet, the Earth's crust had cooled sufficiently for the first continents to begin forming. These movements will give rise to another decisive phenomenon for our planet. Thanks to these plate movements, we see strong mantle activity and intense periods of erosion and alteration. These phenomena, coupled with other events, produce large quantities of CO2 during this period, which in turn contributes to the greenhouse effect. This greenhouse effect keeps the Earth's temperature above 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. For life to flourish, the Earth must be sufficiently hospitable. Extreme temperatures, either too hot or too cold, would eliminate any hope of life. Let's leave the atmosphere behind and continue our exploration in search of clues to the appearance of this possible life. The Earth's internal activity is far more intense than it is today, and the heat in its entrails much higher. Magmatic oceans, melts, and other terrestrial phenomena favor the appearance of rocks that require high temperatures, such as comatite. Today, with its lower internal heat, the Earth could no longer produce this type of rock. Speaking of these rocks, I told you earlier that they are the oldest known. You can see them in specific places around the globe, including Greenland, Western Australia, and South Africa. They offer a completely different terrestrial landscape from what we know. Gray rocks, belts of green rocks, a landscape almost from another world. If it weren't for the presence of water all over the Earth's surface, you'd probably be mistaken. But if you look closely, you can see the moon on the horizon. You'll notice that it's much closer to the Earth than usual. The rocks you see submerged in the water are stromatolites. You can also see an active volcano spewing fiery clouds of dust a little further away. But what really catches your eye here is the water and the presence of carbon. Indeed, these two elements are essential to our quest for knowledge about the genesis of the very first cells. They are the protagonists in the history of life on Earth. According to scientists such as Christophe Tomaso of the Institut de Physique du Globe de Paris and James Casting of the University of Pennsylvania, water, oxygen, and carbon are the most convincing indications of possible life on a planet. It is through the chemistry of water and carbon that life could hatch. For this to happen, water must be stable on the surface. As for the carbon atom, it is one of the atoms most conducive to the establishment of numerous bonds, and thus to the formation of long, complex molecules with multiple properties. We have thus assembled the essential criteria required for the birth of life. Water is plentiful here, and the carbon released by terrestrial activities is produced in abundance, while these stromatolites are proof of the presence of oxygen. These rocks are banded iron formations, i.e., iron oxidized by the presence of oxygen. We still don't know for sure where the first forms of life appeared. Nevertheless, many scientists have put forward theories on the subject. Some believe that life emerged in hydrothermal springs at the bottom of the oceans, while others favor the possibility that the first organisms evolved in small hot pools near volcanoes. What we do know is that it was present in the Archean period. I think it's time for you at last to know how it all began. Here we are. How did the very first life appear on Earth? According to some of the experiments carried out over the last few decades, notably Miller's, life could have hatched in a primordial soup, in small hot pools close to volcanoes, for example. How did scientists arrive at this hypothesis? It all began in 1924 with the hypothesis of Russian biochemist Alexander Oparin, according to which the first living cell was born in a primordial soup. This soup is rich in carbon compounds synthesized in the atmosphere from methane. Stanley Lloyd Miller, an American biologist now considered the father of the chemistry of the origins of life on Earth, continued his research and explored the hypothesis of this primordial soup. He developed a mixture of methane, hydrogen, ammonia, and water, similar to what might have been found in a pond during the Archean period. In this way, he attempted to simulate the conditions that would have prevailed after the formation of the Earth's crust. Miller enclosed these gases in a balloon and subjected them to ultraviolet radiation, similar to that of the young sun, as well as to electrical discharges similar to those that might have occurred naturally, such as during thunderstorms. After a few days, the chemist noticed a dark deposit forming on the walls of the water-filled balloon. This balloon is a representation of the Earth's ocean. Analysis showed that the balloon contained not only formaldehyde and hydrocyanic acid, two molecules that play a key role in the synthesis of organic molecules of biological interest, but also small quantities of amino acids, notably glycine. Prebiotic chemistry could therefore have been at the origin of life on Earth. It was during the Archean, and perhaps even as early as the end of the Hadean, that bits of life, the very first cells, were able to hatch. All conditions were present in this primordial soup. Then, the nature and movement of the water undoubtedly favored the development of these bacteria in the four corners of the globe. Numerous variants of Miller's experiment have since emerged as knowledge of the atmosphere and geology during the Archean period has evolved. These have helped to underpin our knowledge of the first life cells. Other discoveries, this time from outside the Earth, have led to the realization that elements favoring the creation of cells may have come from the universe. At least that's what the study of the Murchison meteorite, which fell in Australia in 1969, has revealed. It contains over 70 different amino acids, 8 of which are used in the composition of proteins. Similar elements have also been found in micrometeorites found in Antarctic ice. This time, analysis suggests that huge quantities of complex carbonaceous matter were delivered to our young Earth just over 4 billion years ago. Scientists have also discovered that the gases escaping from underwater hydrothermal springs contain hydrogen and CO2, generating long chains of carbon and hydrogen. These hydrothermal springs would therefore be synonymous with the source of life, since they constitute the first steps towards membrane synthesis. This discovery brings us to our second hypothesis, undoubtedly one of the most probable in the light of our current knowledge. Here again, it's very difficult to be absolutely certain about the origins of life, the course of evolution, and the processes that triggered the birth of the very first cells. The laws of physics, chemistry, and even biology cannot fully solve the mystery. I'd like to give you an outline of one of the theories put forward, which is certainly as close to reality as we can get, based on the various experiments carried out and the chemical laws we know today. The origin of the first cell would ultimately be a succession of interactions and reactions. If we accept the hypothesis of hydrothermal springs, here's what would have happened. Hydrothermal springs are hot water springs found at ocean ridges at depths ranging from 500 to 5,000 meters, or about 1,600 and 1,650 feet. They are found where two tectonic plates diverge and magma fills the openings as it solidifies. The rock then cools and cracks. These hydrothermal springs form rocks. They are not smooth and totally hermetic. They are stirred up by hot water rising from the earth and cold water rushing in. The rocks have a spongy feel, even though they are very hard and solid. If you magnify part of this rock, you'll see that there are cavities of sorts. These are little cells. They make the rock permeable and are partly made up of iron sulfide. Iron sulfide is an essential element in our equation. It promotes and accelerates certain chemical reactions. As you'll see in a few minutes, life is ultimately a succession of chemical, physical, and biological reactions. Even if you can't really see it with the naked eye, elements such as ammonia, hydrogen, hydrogen sulfide, methane, and phosphorus compounds rise up from the depths of the earth. Within these permeable rocks, acidic seawater flows intersect and intermingle with alkaline freshwater flows. This mixture of seawater and freshwater, as well as elements brought up from the earth, will react when they come into contact with each other. Each cell stores these substances and preserves them at a high temperature. Don't forget that we're standing on the edge of a hydrothermal vent. Heat favors certain chemical reactions. This is the case here. The cells are like little test tubes. This high-temperature contact between 50 and 70 degrees Celsius, or 122 and 158 degrees Fahrenheit, leads to an initial chemical reaction that releases energy and produces new substances. And not just any substances. Sugar, amino acids, and even nucleic acid bases are born. In our rock test tubes, these new elements are bathed in a mixture of water and preserved at an ideal temperature. This allows them to continue their chemical marriage. After a series of successive reactions, the amino acids bind together to form short chains. These short chains, known as peptides, are one of the prerequisites for making proteins. We're slowly approaching the first living cell. As for sugar, it binds with phosphate and one of the elements present in nucleic acid to create what are known as nucleotides. Nucleotides are one of the building blocks of RNA, one of the building blocks of proteins. Another phenomenon is at work in the molecules in these rock cavities. At the same time, other chemical reactions produce DNA. DNA is more stable than RNA, making it easier to store genetic information, something that hasn't really been the case until now. These new molecules are still very primitive. They're a blueprint for more complex life. For the time being, they are still unable to move and remain trapped in their stone caves. Nevertheless, they are already capable of reproducing even beyond their rocky chamber. They can transmit their genetic information to the neighboring cavity and proliferate all along the rock. Precisely when, why, and how? We don't really know, but it turns out that these molecules are also capable of producing fats or lipids. These elements are hydrophobic and cling to the rock walls. Gradually, the lipids spread out over the wall, forming a kind of organic cell membrane. These new abilities are recorded in the DNA so that they can be reproduced. But they are still very fragile. New proteins have been grafted onto these membranes to promote and accelerate certain chemical reactions. They are now capable of producing a cell envelope. This makes them more robust and resistant. At this stage, there are two possibilities for these first molecules to become archaea or bacteria. The cells of these two life forms are then made up of a permeable envelope, enabling them to activate certain chemical processes. But they also have an outer wall, an outer envelope that protects them. Inside, they can produce more complex molecules and record them in their DNA. After a long and laborious chemical process, life can finally emerge. But isn't there a question on your mind? Do you remember that these archaea and bacteria are trapped in rock cavities? How did we come to have life in the four corners of the world and in every nook and cranny of our oceans? Locked in this way, they couldn't move around and expand their territory. Nothing is less certain, but it is assumed the walls of the thermal vent rocks collapsed or cracked, perhaps after internal Earth activity, which would have released them. Their tough, permeable outer walls then play an essential role. They enable archaea and bacteria, once they have escaped from their protective incubator, to settle somewhere near the chimneys. A new rock, a crevice, a crack. They take up residence in a new place that offers them hospitality. Sterile and devoid of any living form, this new environment is then colonized by life. For these organisms, conquering new territories means adapting to new environments and evolving. It's the beginning of a new era in which biodiversity is in its infancy. Armed with this knowledge, you're ready to discover more about the evolution of life on Earth. Do you remember, before tackling the evolution of the very first bacteria, what led us to analyze the cavities of these hydrothermal vent rocks? It was the stromatolites. We were faced with a landscape completely different from what you can see through your living room window. Everything seemed uninhabited. The landscape before us was nothing but rock and water. I'd like to come back to the grayish rocks we encountered earlier. You need to take a closer look at these stromatolites. They're very special, you'll see. This kind of gelatin is actually half living, half rocky. I know. It's quite incredible and rather surprising. Gelatin is made up of bacterial filaments which trap carbon from the air and incorporate it in the form of sediment. This forms the rocky ball you see here. It's through this process that these half-living, half-rocky structures are formed, giving rise to stromatolites. Some of these were discovered 3.5 billion years ago while drilling the craton in Western Australia. A craton in geology is a continental area corresponding to a formerly consolidated zone of the lithosphere. Other, even older stromatolites have been discovered, this time in Greenland. These small geological structures are thought to have resulted from the activity of colonies of aquatic bacteria. Their activity promotes the precipitation of fine films of limestone on the seabed. Over time, these films are superimposed, producing the pointed cone-shaped structures and crushed bumps known as stromatolites. These date back 3.7 billion years. From then on, and for more than 1.5 billion years, life on Earth was exclusively bacterial. The Proterozoic is the third and final period of the Precambrian. It spans almost 2 billion years, from 2.5 billion years ago to 542 million years ago. This eon is divided into 3 periods. The Paleoprotozoic, from the Greek paleos, meaning ancient, stretches from 2.5 to 1.6 billion years ago. Mesoprotozoic, from the Greek mesos, meaning middle, from 1.6 to 1 billion years ago. Neoprotozoic, from the Greek neos, meaning new, extends from 1 billion years to 542 million years ago. Let's go back to where it all began, at the beginning of the first period that makes up the Proterozoic, the Paleoprotozoic. Here we are, the Paleoprotozoic. There's something that must seem very strange to you right now: the orange atmosphere. According to research carried out by an English university team on marine sediments in southern Africa 2.5 billion years ago, the atmosphere was unbreathable and orange. This methane fog is undoubtedly partly to blame. Earth looks like Saturn's moon Titan. The temperature at that time was freezing. Between 2.5 and 2 billion years ago, the Earth underwent a major period of glaciation. A few hundred million years later, it would experience others. You're probably cold just looking at these images. It has to be said that temperatures during this period were far from mild. Surface temperatures averaged minus 25 degrees Celsius or minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit. But minus 50 degrees Celsius or minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit are not uncommon in the region. The Siderean, the first period of the Paleoprotozoic, and part of the following period, the Rhyatian, saw one of the most severe ice ages the Earth has ever known. This glaciation, known as the Huronian glaciation, took place between 2.4 billion and 2.1 billion years ago. It was one of the most important glaciations, but also one of the longest, 300 million years. There are currently 2 hypotheses still under debate as to the cause that led to this glaciation of the Earth. The first involves a reaction between oxygen and methane. This phenomenon, known as great oxidation, transformed methane into carbon dioxide by reacting with methane. This mass-produced carbon dioxide would have produced a greenhouse effect 30 times smaller. Another hypothesis is that volcanoes were dormant for almost 250 million years. With much less carbon dioxide present, the greenhouse effect would have been correspondingly reduced. The Huronian glaciation is not the only natural phenomenon to have marked the Siderean period. At this time, we also speak of banded iron formations, a rather convoluted term to define the birth of iron deposits of a different kind, made possible by the presence of oxygen. Oxygen is present everywhere in the stratigraphic layers of this period. The origin of its presence is undoubtedly the proliferation of blue-green algae. Yes, since our visit to the Archean, things have changed a little in terms of flora and fauna. Bacteria have grown and expanded their territory. The sugar from which they derive their energy has been drastically reduced. The symbiosis they used and the photochemistry that enabled them to survive are no longer possible. So they had to adapt to their new environment and adopt a new way of life using solar energy, photosynthesis, as plants do. This is undoubtedly what led to their confusion and earned them the name of blue-green algae. Until now, our primitive cells drew their energy from chemical substances. These substances are found in abundance straight from the bowels of the earth. It's sugar, produced through various chemical reactions, but for a variety of reasons, this sugar will one day run out. Bacteria will have to adapt if they are to survive, and that's exactly what they do. They manage to draw their energy not from sugar, but from the sun. They use a new mode of operation, photosynthesis. Specific bacterial cells capture the sun's rays. Thanks to this accumulated energy, they are able to break down water into hydrogen and oxygen. This action releases carbon dioxide. The oxygen is released, while the hydrogen and carbon dioxide produce carbohydrates. And these carbohydrates are rich in energy. They're what keep bacteria alive. These photosynthetic cyanobacteria are unicellular, prokaryotic organisms, i.e., their cell structure does not include a nucleus. By using the sun as an energy source to synthesize organic matter, they release oxygen. Lots and lots of oxygen. The first oxygen molecules triggered a series of reactions, bringing about new changes for our planet. Initially, the production of oxygen was offset by the production of iron oxide, and probably had no real impact. But the process soon reached saturation point. There was no longer any reaction to stop the release of oxygen molecules into the air. If the Amazon is the green lung of our planet, the ocean is the blue lung, and the very essence of the air we breathe. It is from the ocean that we still derive much of the oxygen we breathe today. The presence of oxygen in the atmosphere encouraged new transformations in the first living organisms. Hitherto prokaryotic, eukaryotic organisms with well-defined nuclei are now emerging. Genetics adapts to new environmental conditions. Look, here are two algae, two new organisms that symbolize the first steps of evolution. The first is a green algae, of the chlorophytus class. The second is a red algae, of the rhodophytus class. Both use photosynthesis to synthesize organic matter. These multicellular organisms also contribute to the expulsion of oxygen into the atmosphere. But they're far from the only ones to populate the ocean. Many other species have made a place for themselves. Here we find another multicellular eukaryote, quite similar to algae, the Grypania spiralis. It's thread-like and twists itself, a bit like a whirlpool. And here's Eosphera. We've learned a lot about this spheroidal organism. From the first elements we were able to analyze, it appears that it reproduces by fission. Each new cell remains attached to the mother cell, forming a mucilaginous sheath. During the same period, we also find a type of plankton that also uses photosynthesis to survive, phytoplankton. We could stop here on the presentation of Paleoprotozoic animals. Until a few years ago, it was thought that only single-celled organisms populated the world. But in 2010, a university team from Poitiers, France, discovered nearly 250 fossils in Gabon, near Franceville. And, incredible as it may seem, they date back 2.1 billion years. We could never have thought that multicellular organisms could have colonized the planet so many years ago. The oldest, those of the Ediacara fauna, which we'll talk about later, date back some 600 million years. Before the discovery of Franceville, these fossils were the oldest known traces of living organisms. Here we have representations of these complex multicellular organisms with soft, gelatinous bodies. They are neither quite animals nor quite plants. In the end, we know very little about these organisms, apart from their great variety of forms. You can see lobed organisms with serrated edges, smooth-edged organisms, slender, elongated organisms, discoid organisms, or even some with an accumulation of small rounded subunits. Over the years, the animals we've met have left traces in the sediment, but their soft bodies don't fossilize. That's why it's so difficult for us to get a realistic view of these organisms. All unclassified microfossils are classified as acritarchs. The majority are probably algae of all shapes and sizes. Although they differ in appearance, they all have one thing in common: oxygen production. For many bacteria, the increase in oxygen in the atmosphere represents unprecedented chaos. But this catastrophe, while bringing them to a tragic end, also fosters the expansion of other life forms, eukaryotes. When we speak of a unified Earth and a supercontinent, we usually mean Pangaea. But the continents have only linked and unlinked over billions of years. Pangaea was not the first supercontinent to form. At the very beginning of the Mesoprotozoic, a supercontinent called Columbia began to break up. Over time, the supercontinent Rodinia was formed. This was a period of great geological and geographical upheaval, but it was also marked by the appearance of the first modern eukaryotes and sexual reproduction. Let's take a look at one of these specimens. Meet Bangiamorpho pubescens, a red algae. It's one of the oldest complex multicellular organisms known today. So far, we've talked a lot about how these organisms derive their energy, or about their many and varied forms. But during the Mesoproterozoic era, 1.2 billion years ago to be precise, an incredible event occurred that turned evolution on its head. Bangiamorpha pubescens was part of this revolution in life on Earth. Extensive analysis of these fossils has demonstrated the presence of differential spore and gamete formation. This means that the red algae is sexual. This new mode of reproduction not only favors genetic recombination, but also, and above all, complex multicellularity. This is one of the essential building blocks in the evolution of life on Earth. Cells join and attach to each other. This was not the only radical change to take place during this period. Parallel to this event, another revolution in the world of living beings is underway. Cells pass a new milestone. According to scientists, a genetic accident also occurred just over 1 billion years ago. When we think of a genetic accident, it's easy to think of rather dramatic consequences. But genetic accidents can also bring unexpected benefits. To understand this, we first need to know what a genetic accident is. When a cell divides to duplicate itself, it reproduces its DNA exactly. Indeed, this is how it happens in the vast majority of cases. However, it also happens that a change, sometimes minute, occurs during DNA copying. This is known as a mutation. A mutation can be fatal for an organism. It doesn't have the right codes, its functioning is disrupted, and it can't survive. But a mutation can also give rise to new abilities, unexpected and beneficial abilities. Such was the case with the genetic accident that occurred 1 billion years ago. Initially, our little unicellular bacterial organisms were equipped with a flagellum, a sort of little tail. They have a particular DNA with a specific code, notably for proteins. During duplication, the DNA has mutated. A genetic accident modified the original code of this unicellular being, giving the proteins new capacities. They can now interact with others. This phenomenon is crucial to the evolution of life and the diversity of living organisms. It is thanks to this key stage that we pass from a unicellular organism to a multicellular organism. These multicellular organisms become increasingly complex and different from one another. This is the possible birth of plants, fungi, and even animals. For the time being, jellyfish, sponges, corals, polyps, and anemones are gradually taking root at the heart of our underwater world. It's time for us to meet a handful of them in the next period. See you in the Neoprotozoic. We've reached the very last era of the Precambrian. It prepares the Earth for enormous upheavals in the living world. It heralds the imminent arrival of the Cambrian and the explosion of life on Earth. This era takes place between 1 billion and 542 million years ago. It was marked by the fragmentation of the supercontinent Rodinia. Around 800 million years ago, the Earth's landscape, as seen from the sky, was totally different from today. The Earth was a vast ocean from which a single land emerged, Rodinia. 50 million years later, the continent is gradually breaking up. Plate tectonics played its part. The continent began to fracture into two parts, giving rise to the Panthalassa Ocean. This slow division continued over the following millions of years. Like a jigsaw puzzle, it fragmented into several pieces. According to the most recent studies on the subject, it seems that the supercontinent Rodinia broke up into 8 distinct parts. As you'll see, this intense terrestrial activity is both an unprecedented shock and a veritable springboard for life to develop to its full potential. Under the effect of hotspots, the continent of Rodinia is pierced by magma spears. They cut through the Earth's crust, spewing out huge quantities of lava. The ground then began to fracture. This event was accompanied by the opening of oceans and inlets, which increased the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, and hence rainfall. The carbon present in the rain, in the form of carbon dioxide, soon found its way back into the ocean, trapped in sediments in the form of carbonates. At the same time, the enormous lava flows produced by the Rodinia fracture formed basaltic surfaces on the surface of the continents. When eroded by moisture, these basaltic surfaces consume 8 times more carbon than the same granitic surface. Over thousands of years, atmospheric CO2, a greenhouse gas, decreases drastically. As a result, the Earth enters a new period of extreme cold. In fact, our planet has undergone not 1, but 2 periods of glaciation during this period. The first took place 760 million years ago, the second 150 million years later. The latter was one of the most intense. The first stretched from 760 million to 700 million years ago. Then, shortly afterwards, between 620 and 590 million years ago, the Earth faced a second, full-blown ice age. The warming between the interglacial periods was due to volcanism, which was very active during this period of supercontinent fragmentation, releasing large quantities of CO2 over millions of years, triggering a greenhouse effect large enough to thaw the Earth. Bits of life, seem to have found refuge to survive this difficult period. Between these two ice ages, the first two-sided animals appeared. Worms that resembled annelids, others priapulids. Then ice, snow, and cold returned. Our planet was nicknamed Snowball Earth. Seen from space, you probably wouldn't recognize our blue planet. Covered in ice and snow, the pack ice extended, according to studies, perhaps as far as the equator. While this line is synonymous with humid heat, dense, lush forests, incredible waterfalls, and an extraordinarily rich fauna at that time, the equator line would have been almost frozen in ice. All hope of life seemed to be extinguished. No organism could survive here. And yet, it may be that some of them did. How can we be sure? This time, it's not the remains, but technology that's giving us a little help in discovering more about our history and this complex period. Computer simulations, based on advanced calculations and complex algorithms, show the existence of refuge zones running along the equatorial line. For millions of years, organisms lived in isolation in these shelters, then, with the thaw, managed to expand their territory and adapt to a wider environment. Rock analyses show a significant reduction in carbon levels and thus in organic activity. Photosynthesis was also cut off over millions of years. Bacteria therefore suffered the full force of this glacial chaos. The ice cap could be heard hundreds of meters below the surface. At times, temperatures dropped as low as minus 50 degrees Celsius or minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Many bacteria did not survive, and the first algae probably also lost a significant number of specimens during this period of extreme cold. One might think that this glaciation dealt a fatal blow to the evolution and expansion of life on Earth, but it would be a mistake to stop at this preconceived idea. Life is an eternal adaptation. That's what evolution is all about. Look at this little organism. It's a trichoplax. At first glance, it doesn't look like a highly evolved creature. Barely visible to the naked eye, it looks like a large amoeba. It's a placozoan. It belongs to the group of organisms known as metazoans. Placozoans are ultimately metazoans with a particularly simple structure. Trichoplax has no head, tail, legs, or nervous system. It has no digestive tract, nor does it have extracellular digestion. One wonders how it can survive and qualify as a living organism. Yet it has a body covered with cilia, which it uses to move around. Its shape is rather unusual, and we know very little about it. But if we delve a little deeper, we might find that Trichoplax has only 4 different cell types. This confirms its place among simple organisms. And yet, this little animal, along with others of its kind, has undoubtedly played an extremely important role in evolution. This little body contains the protein genes that enable the antero-posterior, dorso-ventral axes, and even 4 of the visual pigment genes. Imagine such a simple, primitive animal is one of the keys to the evolution of living things. It's not alone in this environment, since after the ice ages, algae developed extensively and spread throughout the world's oceans. Underwater waters are becoming more vegetated. Contrary to appearances, this climatic catastrophe was a godsend. It led to a major diversification of living organisms. When the thaw starts, a whole series of chain reactions ensues. The erosion of continents as the ice melts is said to be responsible for the release of vast quantities of nutrients. This abundance of nutrients encourages the expansion and proliferation of phytoplankton. As a domino effect, or snowball effect in our case, the presence of phytoplankton has encouraged the release of oxygen into the atmosphere. This element is one of the keys to the emergence of multicellular life. It exploded in the Cambrian. But for this explosion of life to take place within a few 100 million years, there is still a long way to go in the Proterozoic. Let's explore the oceans to discover the many organisms of this period. The big problem we've had so far is that organisms were made up of soft bodies. After so many years, time has taken its toll on the traces and vestiges of the past. But by the end of the Proterozoic, fossil remains were making it possible to learn more about the flora and fauna of this pivotal period in biological evolution, thanks in particular to the discovery of the Ediacara fauna. Around 600 to 700 million years ago, organic evolution took a new turn. Cells are now divided into two layers. The first is the layer of inner cells, known as the endoderm. This is covered by an outer cell layer, known as the ectoderm. These new beings with two embryonic cell layers are known as diploblastic organisms. This term designates animals without mesoderm, with only an outer wall, a digestive wall, and organs derived from these walls. These new abilities have enabled very different animals to appear on Earth. These include the sponge family, as well as cnidarians such as jellyfish, coral, and hydra. For the first few billion years, life was only possible in an aquatic environment. Although we are fully aware of this ancient life, we can only perceive minute traces of it today. What's more, these organisms have evolved very little so far. Perhaps some chemical evolution has taken place, but again, this is impossible to determine today. The remains of the past are too vague, too abstract to draw any real conclusions. Scientists have great difficulty differentiating between certain remains. Are they the remains of bacteria or algae? Only size can sometimes distinguish between the two. But from now on, everything changes and everything becomes possible. Earth will never again be uninhabited. Evolution is underway. Life takes on a new lease of life. Although organisms always consist of a soft body, they also have integuments, i.e. a set of external structures, an integumentary system, which protects the animal from the outside environment. Today's animals have a variety of integuments, including hair, scales, and feathers. This integumentary system is a real game changer for scientists, who can now rely on much more convincing evidence. Teguments are resistant and have enabled fossilization. Here's what these remnants of another time have revealed. The first thing we notice is that organisms begin by gaining a few centimeters. For billions of years, they remain microscopic. From now on, they'll be bigger and bigger. The rangiomorph is one of them. It's an organism that resembles a long leaf. It also has a stem connected to the seabed. Scientists have put forward a hypothesis about this evolution. They wondered why organisms grew taller. The first theory was linked to feeding, but was soon abandoned. There were plenty of nutrients around, so it's highly unlikely that this criterion had such a significant impact on evolution. If not to feed more easily, why grow? The number of small specimens grouped alongside this large rangeomorph suggests that larger size may have favored reproduction. The animals also developed a new shape. They are symmetrical animals with appendages that function in pairs. This particular shape enabled them to become burrowing animals. They feed on organic matter covering the ground. They can be tube-shaped, leaf-shaped, or sac-like. The main representative of these late Proterozoic animals are grouped together in what is known as the Ediacara fauna. It has been so named since the discovery, in 1946, of a wide variety of fossils around 560 million years old in Australia's Ediacara Hills. Since then, similar specimens have been found elsewhere in the world, including Canada, South Africa, Siberia, and Europe. Here are a few animals from the Ediacara fauna. Here, these circular animals with concentric rings are Aspidella. They measure up to 8 centimeters or 3 inches long, and 4 centimeters or 2 inches wide. A little further on, it's a Charnia. There are 3 known species of Charnia: Charnia wardi, Charnia antecedens, and Charnia masoni. The latter looks a little like a feather or leaf. The Charnia wardi genus was one of the largest, growing up to 2 meters or 7 feet. Other species resemble animals we know today: jellyfish. The jellyfish group was quite common in the oceans at the time. Cyclomedusa davidi and Cyclomedusa radiata are among them. Another animal, another form. Here's a Sphrygina. It too bears some resemblance to the fauna we know. It resembles a worm with a head, a body, and a kind of spike that allows it to anchor itself in the seabed. It probably slid through the mud to find nutrients. Seaweed is also ever present. Here again, we have a lovely specimen of Bangiomorpha pubescens right in front of us, a red algae. Finally, a Dickinsonia. We know very little about it, and scientists are still finding it hard to classify. However, we do know that it was able to move, as traces of movement are attached to it. Oval in shape and measuring from a few millimeters to around 1.4 meters or 5 feet in length, it has a radiate structure. The term radiata is also used to define this criterion. This means that these organisms, invertebrates, have axial symmetry with cyclic patterns around this axis. Like most organisms in this category, Dickinsonia is also characterized by the 2 cell sheets we mentioned for diploblastic animals. That is, it has an endoderm and an ectoderm. These 2 layers are separated by an acellular gel. There's another rather unusual feature of this animal. A single orifice serves as both mouth and anus. This is the very beginning of evolution, and differentiated organs are not yet in vogue. Summing up the main stages of biological evolution in a few lines, it all really began 3.9 billion years ago. It's possible that this event occurred earlier, but there are no remains to confirm this. At that time, the largest living creatures were only 1/10 of a millimeter in size and were limited to the kingdom of bacteria. Nearly 1 billion years later, around 2.8 billion years ago, the cellular world evolved, leaving a small space for eukaryotes, organisms with a nucleus. They are capable of symbiosis with proteobacteria. They draw their energy from substances supplied by the Earth. A few 100 million years later, around 2.1 billion years ago, a new type of eukaryote appeared, more complex and elaborate. This time, these cyanobacteria took advantage of photosynthesis and drew their energy from the sun. By the end of the Proterozoic, more varied forms of organisms had become part of the cycle of life. They were able to move, were sexually mature, and diploblastic. Underwater riches are flourishing. Yet 542 million years ago, all these organisms disappeared. We don't know what caused this mass extinction. No meteorite, no volcano, no major glaciation was responsible for the disappearance of all the primitive forms of the Precambrian. But it is sometimes in the midst of chaos that positive things can happen. Remember, glaciation allowed eukaryotes to evolve. This widespread extinction, in turn, gave way to the Cambrian explosion. This is one of the greatest stages in biological evolution. It makes a new turning point for the living world and for our planet. Most of today's major metazoan phyla will emerge. It's a veritable zoological Big Bang. Animal, plant, and bacterial species are about to emerge. The only thing that Precambrian and Cambrian species have in common is that they too will be born in the ocean.